Ambassador Marcus Collins had spent 3 months navigating the labyrinthine protocols of the Viridian Imperial Palace, but the evening walks through the Crystal Gardens had become his sanctuary from the endless diplomatic complexities that filled his days. The gardens themselves were a marvel of alien engineering, living crystal formations that grew like plants, their faceted surfaces catching and refracting the light of Ethros Prime's twin moons into patterns that shifted like aurora across the ground. Tonight's walk was supposed to clear his head after another frustrating session with Queen Lyriletha's Trade Council, where every concession felt like a chess move in a game whose rules he only half understood. The Viridians were proving to be shrewd negotiators, their offers for mineral rights coming with conditions that seemed reasonable on the surface but carried implications that made Marcus's legal advisors nervous. He had rounded the fountain of singing crystals and was heading toward the meditation alcoves when he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it over the gentle harmonics of the garden's living architecture. Someone was crying. Marcus paused, his diplomatic training immediately assessing the situation. Palace gardens were supposed to be private spaces where servants and nobles alike could find moments of peace away from the formal rigidity of court life. Encountering someone in distress here could be a violation of privacy, a cultural misunderstanding, or potentially a security concern. But the sound was so quiet, so carefully muffled, that it spoke of someone trying desperately not to be heard. And something about that deliberate silence tugged at Marcus's conscience in a way that overrode diplomatic caution. Following the sound deeper into the garden, he found her hidden behind a grove of crystal trees whose bell-like leaves chimed softly in the evening breeze. She sat on a stone bench with her face in her hands, her silver veil, the traditional head covering worn by palace servants, torn and disheveled. Her shoulders shook with the kind of silent sobs that came from someone who had learned to cry without making noise. Marcus recognized her immediately, though he realized with some embarrassment that recognition came more from her role in his daily routine than from any personal attention he'd paid to her as an individual. Sarah, he knew her name only because he'd asked once, months ago, wanting to thank the person who managed his quarters with such meticulous care. She was young, probably in her early 20s by human standards, with the characteristic opalescent skin of the Viridians that shifted between silver and pale blue depending on the light. What he had noticed about her, in the peripheral way one notices exceptionally efficient service, was the distinctive violet markings around her eyes that marked her as from one of the outer provinces, and the way she seemed to anticipate his needs before he expressed them. His rooms were always perfectly arranged, his meals tailored to preferences he hadn't known he had, his schedule managed with a precision that made his diplomatic work smoother than it had any right to be. She was, he realized, the invisible foundation that made his entire mission possible. And now she was crying as if her world had ended. "Sarah," he said softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. She looked up at the sound of her name, her violet-marked eyes wide with shock and what might have been terror. For a moment, she simply stared at him as if he were an apparition, then she began fumbling with her torn veil, trying to restore some semblance of the proper servant's demeanor. "Ambassador Collins," she said, her voice thick with tears but attempting the neutral tone that palace protocol required. "I apologize for, this is inappropriate. I should not be." "You should not be what?" "Upset." "Human." Marcus pulled out his handkerchief and offered it to her, noting how she stared at the simple gesture as if it were some kind of alien artifact. "Sarah, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "I am not injured," she said, accepting the handkerchief with trembling fingers. "Thank you for your kindness, but I should return to my duties." She started to rise, but Marcus held up a gentle hand. "Please. I'm not here as an ambassador right now, just as someone who's concerned about another person's well-being." "What happened?" The simple question seemed to break something inside her. Fresh tears welled up in her eyes, and she sank back onto the bench as if her legs could no longer support her. "You would not understand," she whispered. "Your world, your people. You do not have the same complications. Try me." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through fear, hope, and something that might have been desperate need to be heard by someone, anyone, who might listen without judgment. The Queen summoned me today, she said finally. To discuss your care, your preferences, your satisfaction with palace accommodations. Marcus nodded. It made sense that Queen Lireleth would want feedback about the treatment of such an important diplomatic guest. She was pleased with my service, Sarah continued, her voice growing smaller. She said I had performed my duties invisibly, as a proper servant should. She said. Sarah's voice broke, and she pressed Marcus's handkerchief to her eyes. What did she say? She said that you barely acknowledged my existence. That I was invisible to you, as a good servant should be. Sarah looked up at him with eyes full of pain. She meant it as praise. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand the implications of what Queen Lireleth had said, and more importantly, why it had devastated the young woman sitting before him. Sarah, he said carefully, why did that upset you so much? She was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the crystalline chimes of the garden. Because I had hoped. I had foolishly hoped, that when you thanked me for my service, when you asked my name, when you smiled when you saw me. I had hoped that perhaps you saw me as more than just part of the palace furniture. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow as he realized what he had failed to see, failed to understand about the careful attention she had paid to his needs, the way her face had lit up on the rare occasions when he had acknowledged her directly. I had hoped, she continued, that someone like you might see someone like me as a person worthy of notice. Marcus stared at her, understanding flooding through him like ice water. His basic politeness, the simple courtesy of thanking someone for their service, of learning their name, of treating them with basic human dignity, had created hope in someone whose position made such hope both precious and dangerous. Sarah, he said softly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Are you actually a servant? She looked up at him with surprise that quickly shifted to something approaching fear. What do you mean? I mean that in 3 months of diplomatic negotiations, I've learned to read people pretty well. And you don't carry yourself like someone born to service. You move like someone accustomed to authority, you speak like someone educated for leadership, and you understand political nuances that most palace servants wouldn't recognize. Sarah's hands tightened on his handkerchief, and Marcus saw the moment when she made the decision to trust him with something that could be dangerous for both of them. You are very observant, Ambassador, she said quietly. No, I am not a servant by birth. My family once held significant position in the outer provinces. We were advisors, administrators, advocates for policy reforms that would benefit the common citizens rather than just the nobility. What happened? We opposed certain of Queen Lireleth's policies. Not treasonously, not violently, but we argued for social programs that would have reduced the profits of established noble houses. We advocated for education initiatives that would allow lower castes to advance based on merit rather than birth. Marcus felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. And Queen Lireleth decided to make an example of your family. She is not cruel, Sarah said quickly, though whether she was defending the Queen or trying to protect herself from accusations of disloyalty wasn't clear. She did not have us executed or exiled. Instead, we were reassigned. Reduced to service positions where our education and abilities could be put to use serving the palace while demonstrating to other potential reformers the consequences of opposing established order. She made you servants to show what happens to nobles who get ideas above their station. She made us invisible, Sarah corrected. Which is worse than being dead. The dead are remembered. The invisible are forgotten. Marcus sat beside her on the crystal bench, his mind reeling as he understood how completely he had misread the situation he'd been living in for 3 months. Sarah, when I thanked you for your service, when I learned your name. It was the first time in 2 years that anyone had addressed me directly as a person rather than as a function of the palace machinery, she said. I began to hope that perhaps someone from outside our rigid system might see past the servant's uniform to the person underneath. And Queen Lireleth's comment destroyed that hope. It confirmed what I should have known all along. That kindness is not the same as recognition, that courtesy is not the same as respect, and that someone like you would never truly see someone like me. Marcus looked at this remarkable woman who had been rendered invisible by a system that valued social order over human worth, whose intelligence and dedication had been channeled into managing his daily life while her own life was effectively ended. Sarah, he said firmly, Queen Lireleth was wrong. Ambassador. I do see you. I just didn't understand what I was seeing. But I do now. For the first time since he'd found her crying, something that might have been hope flickered in her violet-marked eyes. What does that mean? Marcus looked around the crystal garden where they sat hidden among the chiming trees, understanding that whatever he said next would change everything about his diplomatic mission and his understanding of the civilization he'd been sent to negotiate with. It means, he said slowly, that there's a lot more to this palace than politics. And I think it's time I learned what that really means. The following evening found Marcus waiting in the crystal gardens at the same spot where he had discovered Sarah's tears, though tonight he came not by chance but by design. Their conversation had haunted him through an entire day of negotiations, coloring every interaction with Queen Lireleth and her council with new understanding of the costs hidden beneath the Empire's polished surface. You came, Sarah said softly, emerging from the shadows with the careful movements of someone who had learned to be invisible but was still afraid of being caught being visible. I said I would. Marcus gestured to the bench where she had cried the night before. I've been thinking about what you told me. About your family, your situation, the way the system works here. Sarah settled beside him, maintaining the careful distance that protocol required even in private, though Marcus noticed she no longer wore the torn veil from the previous evening. Tonight her head covering was pristine, her servant's uniform perfectly arranged, her demeanor composed in the way that spoke of someone who had learned to hide pain behind professional competence. Ambassador, she said carefully, I hope I did not burden you with inappropriate concerns. My difficulties are not your responsibility. Sarah, stop. Marcus turned to face her directly. Last night you trusted me with the truth about your situation. Tonight I want to understand it better. Not because it's my responsibility, but because I care about what happens to you. The simple statement seemed to surprise her. You care. I care that someone of obvious intelligence and ability is being wasted in a system that punishes independent thinking. I care that you've been rendered invisible for the crime of believing in social justice. And I care that my basic politeness created hope in someone whose position made that hope both precious and dangerous. Sarah's carefully maintained composure wavered. You must understand, Ambassador, that what you call basic politeness was extraordinary kindness from my perspective. For 2 years, I have been addressed only when receiving orders or corrections. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person. Tell me about your family. Your life before. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, her gaze fixed on the crystal formations that sang softly in the evening breeze. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been suppressed but never forgotten. My father was provincial administrator for the Outer Territories, responsible for managing resources and population across 12 worlds. My mother served as cultural liaison, helping integrate new species into the Empire while preserving their unique traditions. I was educated for leadership from childhood, diplomacy, administration, economic theory, military strategy. Sounds like you were being prepared for significant responsibility. I was being prepared to inherit my father's position. The Outer Territories require administrators who understand both imperial law and local customs, who can balance central authority with regional autonomy. It's complex work that requires someone who cares about the people being governed, not just the resources being extracted. Marcus heard the passion in her voice and understood that this wasn't just career preparation, it was calling. What changed? The mining rights expansion initiative, Sarah said with the tone of someone naming something distasteful. 5 years ago, Queen Lireleth proposed dramatically increasing mineral extraction from the outer worlds to fund expansion into the Centauri sector. The profits would have been enormous for the imperial treasury and the noble houses that held extraction contracts. But But the environmental and social costs would have been catastrophic for the populations living on those worlds. Strip mining operations that would have displaced millions of beings, contaminated water supplies, destroyed ecosystems that had taken millennia to develop. Marcus could see where this was heading. Your family opposed the initiative. We proposed alternatives. Sustainable extraction methods that would have yielded smaller short-term profits but preserved the long-term viability of the worlds and the well-being of their populations. We argued for revenue-sharing agreements that would have given local populations stake in the extraction operations rather than simply making them victims of it. And Queen Lireleth's response? She listened politely, thanked us for our input, and proceeded with the original plan. When we continued to advocate for alternatives, when we began building coalitions among other provincial administrators who shared our concerns, she decided you were a threat to imperial authority. She decided we were naive idealists who didn't understand the practical necessities of governing an empire. Sarah's voice carried years of suppressed bitterness. We were reassigned to positions where our idealism could be properly channeled into harmless service rather than dangerous policy advocacy. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, not just at the injustice of Sarah's situation, but at his own blindness to the system he'd been negotiating with. How many families were affected? Dozens. Provincial administrators, cultural liaisons, military officers, economic advisors, anyone who had argued for policies that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term profit extraction. Sarah gestured toward the palace that loomed over the gardens. Half the servants in this palace are former nobles whose crime was believing that good governance should serve all citizens rather than just the aristocracy. And no one speaks up about this. Who would listen? The remaining nobles benefit from the system as it exists. The common citizens don't have access to information about policy debates. The displaced families. Sarah's voice grew smaller. We've learned that surviving requires accepting invisibility. Marcus processed this information, understanding that the mineral rights negotiations he'd been conducting were built on the same extraction policies that had destroyed Sarah's family and countless others like them. Sarah, the current negotiations between Earth and the Viridian Empire, do they involve the same worlds where your family served? Yes. She looked at him directly, her violet-marked eyes holding depths of knowledge that his diplomatic briefings had never mentioned. The mineral deposits that Queen Lireleth is offering to share with humanity are located primarily in the outer territories. The extraction methods she's proposing are the same ones my family opposed 5 years ago. The same ones that would displace millions of beings. The same ones that have already displaced millions of beings. The initiative proceeded as planned after the opposition was neutralized. Marcus felt the foundations of his diplomatic mission shifting beneath him. The trade agreements he'd been negotiating weren't just about securing energy resources for humanity, they were about participating in a system of extraction that treated entire populations as acceptable collateral damage. Why are you telling me this? Because, Sarah said quietly, you asked. Because for the first time in 2 years, someone has shown interest in understanding the true costs of the system they're dealing with. And because. She paused, looking away from him with an expression that seemed to wrestle with dangerous honesty. Because why? Because I hoped that perhaps someone from outside our system might see alternatives that we could not achieve from within it. That perhaps your people's involvement might create opportunities for the changes my family once advocated for. Marcus stared at her, understanding that she was placing tremendous trust in him, not just by sharing sensitive political information, but by revealing that she still harbored hope for reform despite everything that had been done to crush such hopes. Sarah, what you're describing, it's not just about social justice. It's about the fundamental nature of the relationship between Earth and the Viridian Empire. Yes. If I were to raise concerns about extraction methods, about population displacement, about sustainable development, it would complicate your negotiations considerably, she said with a sad smile. Queen Lireleth has built her expansion plans around the assumption that humanity is interested in resource access, not governance ethics. And if humanity insisted on ethical extraction as a condition of partnership? It would either force meaningful reform or end the negotiations entirely. Marcus looked at this remarkable woman who had trusted him with information that could derail his entire mission, understanding that she was offering him a choice between diplomatic success and moral responsibility. "Sarah, if the negotiations fail because I insist on ethical conditions, what happens to you?" "The same thing that happens to me if they succeed," she said simply. "I remain invisible, my family remains in exile, and the system continues as it always has. But if they succeed with reformed terms, then perhaps the millions of beings whose lives hang in the balance might have hope for something better." Marcus sat in the crystal garden, listening to the alien music of living stone while contemplating the most important decision of his diplomatic career. Everything he'd been sent to accomplish could be achieved by ignoring what he'd learned, by maintaining the comfortable blindness that let him see Queen Lireleth as merely a shrewd negotiator rather than the architect of systematic oppression. Or he could choose to see what had been made invisible, to use his position to advocate for those who had been silenced, and to risk everything he'd been sent to achieve for the chance to make it mean something more than just another extraction agreement. "Sarah," he said finally, "tomorrow I meet with Queen Lireleth for final negotiations. I want you to help me understand exactly what questions I should be asking." For the first time since he'd known her, Sarah smiled. Not the careful, professional expression of a servant acknowledging orders, but the genuine joy of someone who had discovered that hope might not be entirely foolish after all. "Ambassador," she said softly, "it would be my honor." The next morning's negotiation session with Queen Lireleth began exactly as the previous dozen had, with elaborate ceremonies, formal protocols, and the kind of diplomatic theater that Marcus had learned to navigate with professional competence. But today, armed with Sarah's insights into the true costs of the agreements he was negotiating, every familiar ritual felt different. "Ambassador Collins," Queen Lireleth said, settling onto her crystal throne with the fluid grace that marked Viridian royalty, "I trust you have had time to review our latest proposals for mineral extraction quotas and revenue sharing." "I have, Your Majesty. They're quite generous." Marcus consulted his notes, aware that Sarah was somewhere in the palace, probably managing the details that would make this meeting run smoothly while remaining invisible to everyone except him. "However, I do have some questions about implementation." "Of course. What specific concerns does Earth have about our proposed methods?" "I'd like to understand more about the current populations on the worlds where extraction would take place. Environmental impact assessments, relocation procedures for affected communities, long-term sustainability protocols." Queen Lireleth's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught a slight pause that suggested his questions were not what she had expected. "Ambassador, such details are typically handled at the operational level rather than in diplomatic frameworks. Our extraction specialists are quite experienced in managing local considerations." "I'm sure they are. But Earth's government has recently implemented strict ethical sourcing requirements for all resource agreements. We need to ensure that our partnerships align with our values regarding environmental protection and population rights." This was not entirely true. Earth's government had given Marcus considerable latitude in negotiating terms that would secure the energy resources humanity desperately needed. But his conversations with Sarah had made him realize that the values underlying the agreement mattered as much as the economic benefits. "Certainly," Queen Lireleth said smoothly. "Perhaps you could outline Earth-specific requirements so that we can address them appropriately." Marcus pulled out a data pad where he had spent the morning formulating questions based on Sarah's guidance about the realities behind the Empire's polished presentations. "First, we'd like detailed demographic data for all affected worlds, including population density, species composition, and current economic activities that would be impacted by extraction operations. That information is available, though it may take some time to compile in formats suitable for human analysis. Second, we'd like to review environmental impact studies and mitigation plans, particularly regarding water table protection and ecosystem preservation. Also available, though I should note that Viridian environmental standards may differ from human expectations due to our different physiological needs." Marcus nodded, aware that he was walking into territory that could either improve the agreement or destroy it entirely. "Third, We'd like to understand the consultation and consent processes used with local populations, including any compensation or relocation assistance provided to affected communities. The pause that followed was longer this time, and Marcus saw something shift in Queen Lyriletha's violet eyes. Ambassador, may I ask what has prompted these specific concerns? Our previous discussions focused primarily on extraction quotas and revenue distribution. Earth's parliament has become more sensitive to the ethical implications of our foreign partnerships. Recent scandals involving resource extraction on colony worlds have made our government cautious about agreements that might exploit vulnerable populations. I see. Queen Lyrileth leaned forward slightly, her gaze growing more intense. And these new requirements are absolute prerequisites for Earth's participation? Marcus felt the weight of the moment, understanding that his answer would determine not just the success of his mission but the fate of millions of beings he would never meet. They are significant factors in our decision-making process, yes. Queen Lyrileth was quiet for several minutes, her expression cycling through calculation, consideration, and what might have been concern. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted from diplomatic courtesy to something approaching directness. Ambassador Collins, I appreciate Earth's commitment to ethical governance. However, I feel I should clarify something about the realities of managing an interstellar empire. Please do. The resources we are offering to share with humanity are located on worlds that have been fully integrated into the Viridian Empire for decades. The extraction methods we employ are those that have proven most efficient for maximizing yield while maintaining operational security. Operational security. The stability that comes from established procedures and clear authority structures. These worlds are productive and peaceful precisely because they operate according to proven imperial protocols. Marcus recognized the careful language of someone explaining a system without acknowledging its costs. And the populations that were displaced to achieve this stability? Queen Lyriletha's eyes sharpened, and Marcus realized he had just revealed that his knowledge extended beyond the official briefings he should have received. Displaced is a strong word, Ambassador. Relocated, integrated, assigned to positions where their skills could best serve imperial interests, these are normal aspects of efficient governance. Even when those positions involve reducing former administrators to servant roles. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Queen Lyrileth studied Marcus with the intensity of someone re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about their negotiating partner. That is a very specific concern, Ambassador. May I ask how you became aware of historical personnel decisions that would not typically be included in diplomatic briefings? Marcus felt the diplomatic equivalent of standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that his next words would either build bridges or burn them entirely. Your Majesty, in 3 months of residence in your palace, I've had opportunity to observe how your government actually functions rather than just how it presents itself in formal negotiations. And what observations have led you to question established imperial policies? The observation that some of the most competent, intelligent, and dedicated people I've encountered here are serving in positions far below their capabilities and qualifications. The observation that dissent seems to be managed through exile and reduction rather than engagement and debate. Queen Lyrileth stood from her throne, moving with the controlled grace that Marcus had learned could signal either approach or attack. Ambassador, you seem to have developed rather detailed opinions about internal Viridian governance. I wonder who might have provided such insights. The threat in her tone was unmistakable. Marcus understood that continuing this conversation could not only end his mission but potentially endanger Sarah and others who had shared their experiences with him. Your Majesty, my insights come from basic observation and the application of human values to what I've witnessed. No one has violated protocols or shared inappropriate information. Human values, Queen Lyrileth repeated. And these values require that resource extraction agreements include provisions for populations that have already been successfully integrated into imperial systems. These values require that we understand the true costs of the partnerships we enter into. Even if those costs are outweighed by the benefits to all parties. Especially then. Sustainable partnerships require honest acknowledgement of trade-offs rather than comfortable ignorance of inconvenient realities. Queen Lireleth returned to her throne, but her posture remained tense, alert. Ambassador Collins, I believe we have moved beyond the scope of resource negotiations into questions of fundamental governance philosophy. Perhaps we have. But I don't think we can separate the two. The way resources are extracted reflects the values of the civilizations involved in that extraction. And if the Viridian Empire's values prove incompatible with Earth's requirements? Marcus felt the full weight of the choice he was making, not just for himself, but for humanity's energy future and for the millions of beings whose lives hung in the balance of these negotiations. Then we'll need to find ways to make them compatible, or we'll need to accept that some partnerships aren't worth the moral compromises they require. Queen Lireleth stared at him for a long moment, her violet eyes holding depths that spoke of calculations being made at speeds that transcended normal diplomatic consideration. Ambassador, I believe this conversation has reached a point where continued formal discussion would be unproductive. I suggest we recess until tomorrow to allow both parties to consider the implications of what has been discussed. Of course, Your Majesty. However, she continued, her tone becoming significantly colder, I feel I should mention that your concerns about imperial personnel policies have been noted. I trust that your remaining time in the palace will be focused on diplomatic rather than observational activities. The warning was clear enough that even diplomatic protocols couldn't disguise it. Marcus bowed formally and withdrew from the throne room, understanding that he had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. That evening, Marcus waited in the Crystal Gardens with growing anxiety. Sarah was late for their scheduled meeting, and every passing minute increased his worry that his confrontation with Queen Lireleth had already had consequences. When she finally appeared, moving through the shadows with unusual caution, her demeanor was different, not just careful, but frightened. Ambassador, she said quietly, settling beside him on their usual bench but maintaining more distance than had become customary between them. I believe we may have a problem. What kind of problem? This afternoon, I was summoned for questioning by the Palace Security Council. They wanted to know about my interactions with you, the topics of our conversations, and whether I had shared any information about palace operations or imperial policies. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What did you tell them? The truth, within limits. That you had asked general questions about Viridian culture, that I had provided basic information about customs and protocols, and that our conversations had been entirely appropriate to my role as your assigned caretaker. Did they believe you? They seemed skeptical. Particularly when they asked specific questions about your knowledge of provincial administration and personnel policies. Sarah, I'm sorry. I tried to protect your privacy, but you asked questions that revealed information only someone in my position could have provided, she finished. I understand. You were trying to advocate for justice, and I was the one who encouraged you to ask those questions. Marcus studied her face in the moonlight, noting tension that went beyond mere concern about disciplinary action. There's more, isn't there? Palace security informed me that my assignment to your care is being reassessed. They're concerned that my family background might have influenced my service in ways inappropriate to your diplomatic status. They're removing you from your position. They're removing me from the palace entirely. Tomorrow morning, I'm to be transferred to an agricultural collective in the far provinces. For the good of imperial security and my own welfare, of course. Marcus felt anger surge through him at the euphemistic language that disguised exile as concern. This is punishment for our conversations. This is what happens when invisible people become visible, Sarah said with a sad smile. The system has ways of restoring proper order when that order is disturbed. I won't let this happen. Ambassador, you cannot prevent this. You've already risked more than you should have by raising concerns about imperial policies. If you attempt to intervene directly in personnel decisions, it will end the negotiations and probably get me expelled from Viridian space, Marcus finished. But Sarah, I can't just sit here and let them exile you for the crime of helping me understand the truth. The truth, she repeated quietly. Do you know what the most difficult truth is, Ambassador? What? That individual kindness, however genuine, cannot overcome systemic injustice. That your recognition of my worth as a person, however meaningful to me personally, cannot change the fact that systems like this are designed to neutralize threats to their stability. Marcus wanted to argue, to insist that individual actions could create broader change, but the evidence of Sarah's impending exile seemed to contradict his optimism. So we just accept that the system wins? That people like you get disappeared while people like me maintain comfortable ignorance about the costs of our diplomatic successes? We accept that changing systems requires more than good intentions and moral outrage. It requires power, strategy, and the willingness to accept consequences that extend far beyond individual sacrifice. Sarah stood from the bench, her movements carrying the finality of someone saying goodbye. Ambassador, I want you to know that our conversations have meant more to me than you can possibly understand. For a brief time, you made me visible again. You reminded me that I exist as more than just a function of imperial efficiency. Sarah, wait. Tomorrow, you will complete your negotiations with Queen Lyrilleth. You will secure the resources that humanity needs, and you will return to Earth having successfully served your people's interests. That is what a good diplomat does. And you'll disappear into agricultural exile for the crime of helping me understand what those interests actually cost. I will serve the Empire in whatever capacity is deemed appropriate, as I have been trained to do. Marcus stood as well, understanding that this might be their final conversation but unwilling to accept that their growing connection would end with her disappearance into anonymous exile. Sarah, what if there was another way? What do you mean? Marcus looked at her, at the woman whose intelligence and insight had opened his eyes to truths he'd been blind to, whose trust had challenged him to choose moral courage over diplomatic convenience. An idea was forming in his mind, dangerous, unprecedented, and possibly impossible, but the only alternative he could see to accepting defeat. What if your exile didn't have to be permanent? What if there was a way to make your knowledge and abilities valuable enough that the Empire couldn't afford to waste them? I don't understand. Tomorrow's negotiations don't have to proceed as everyone expects. I could make proposals that would require precisely the kind of expertise that you possess. I could create conditions that would make your restoration not just possible, but necessary. Sarah stared at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. Ambassador, such an approach would risk everything you've been sent to accomplish. Maybe it's time to accomplish something worth the risk. For the first time since he'd known her, Sarah reached out and touched his hand, a gesture that violated every protocol but somehow felt like the most honest communication they'd ever shared. If you attempt this, she said quietly, there will be no going back. For either of us. Then we'd better make sure it works. Marcus entered the final negotiation session with Queen Lyrilleth carrying a proposal that would either revolutionize human-Viridian relations or end his diplomatic career in spectacular failure. He had spent the night crafting terms that would require precisely the kind of expertise that Sarah possessed, creating a framework where her restoration would become a practical necessity rather than a charitable gesture. Your Majesty, he began, after the formal protocols had been completed, Earth has decided to proceed with the resource agreement, but with modified terms that reflect our commitment to ethical partnership. Queen Lyrilleth's expression remained carefully neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tension in her posture that suggested she was prepared for complications. What modifications does Earth propose? Marcus consulted his data pad, aware that every word would determine the fate of his mission and Sarah's future. First, we request the establishment of joint oversight committees for all extraction operations, with representatives from both Earth and the Viridian Empire as well as local population liaisons. Local population liaisons. Individuals familiar with the specific worlds involved, their environmental conditions, cultural practices, and economic systems. People who can ensure that extraction operations are conducted in ways that serve all stakeholders rather than just maximizing yield. Queen Lyrilleth leaned forward slightly. Ambassador, the worlds in question have been under imperial administration for decades. Local expertise is already integrated into our operational procedures. I'm sure it is. But Earth's requirements specify that such expertise must be formally recognized and empowered to influence decision-making rather than simply consulted for information. And you believe such individuals are available? I believe they're currently underutilized. Marcus met her gaze directly. Your Majesty, yesterday you asked about my observations of imperial governance. One observation is that this empire has a remarkable pool of talented administrators who have been reassigned to positions that don't make full use of their capabilities. The silence that followed was charged with implications that both understood perfectly. You're referring to specific individuals, Queen Lireleth said carefully. I'm referring to a systematic approach that would identify and restore individuals whose expertise matches the requirements of our joint oversight framework. People who understand both imperial systems and local conditions, who have experience in sustainable resource management, and who possess the trust of the populations they would be serving. Such as former provincial administrators who were reassigned due to policy disagreements. Such as qualified individuals whose expertise has become relevant again due to changing partnership requirements. Queen Lireleth stood from her throne, moving to the great window that looked out over her capital city. For several minutes, she said nothing, her expression cycling through calculation, frustration, and what might have been grudging admiration. Ambassador Collins, she said finally, you're proposing to make the success of our resource agreement dependent on the rehabilitation of individuals who were removed from positions of authority for opposing imperial policy. I'm proposing to make the success of our resource agreement dependent on utilizing the best available expertise, regardless of its current administrative classification. And if I refuse to restore these individuals to positions where they could influence imperial operations, then Earth would need to seek resource partnerships with civilizations whose governance approaches align more closely with our ethical requirements. The threat was politely phrased but unmistakably clear. Queen Lireleth turned from the window to study Marcus with the intensity of someone reassessing every assumption they had made about their negotiating partner. This is quite a shift from your original mandate, Ambassador. When did Earth's priorities expand from resource acquisition to governance reform? When we realized that sustainable partnerships require shared values rather than just mutual benefit. And these shared values require the restoration of individuals like. She paused, clearly deciding how directly to address what they both knew they were discussing. Like the former administrative staff who have been serving in reduced capacities. These shared values require recognition that competence and dedication shouldn't be wasted due to political disagreements that may have been based on incomplete information. Incomplete information? Marcus took the calculated risk of revealing the depth of his understanding. Your Majesty, the extraction policies that were implemented 5 years ago have indeed generated substantial revenue for the imperial treasury. But they've also created social instabilities, environmental degradation, and economic disruptions that are beginning to affect the long-term viability of the affected worlds. Where did you obtain this assessment? From basic observation combined with analysis of publicly available data. The same analysis that suggests the individuals who originally opposed those policies may have been correct about their long-term consequences. Queen Lireleth returned to her throne, but her posture remained tense, alert. And you believe that restoring these individuals to positions of authority would improve both the extraction operations and the stability of the affected worlds? I believe that expertise should be utilized rather than wasted, and that good governance requires incorporating diverse perspectives rather than silencing them. Even when those perspectives challenge established authority. Especially then. Strong leadership isn't threatened by competent advisors, it's strengthened by them. Queen Lireleth was quiet for a long time, her violet eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like he was being examined at the molecular level. Ambassador, she said finally, what you're proposing would require me to acknowledge that imperial policies implemented under my authority were flawed. That individuals I punished for opposition were actually providing valuable counsel that should have been heeded. I'm proposing that strong leaders have the courage to adapt their policies when circumstances change and new information becomes available. And the individuals who would be restored under this framework, you have specific recommendations? Marcus felt his heart racing as he approached the moment that would determine everything. I have identified several individuals whose expertise would be particularly valuable for the oversight committees. Former provincial administrators with experience in sustainable development, cultural liaisons familiar with multi-species integration, economic advisors who understand the balance between resource extraction and population welfare. Including the individual who has been managing your personal care during your residence here. The direct question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus understood that Queen Lireleth was testing whether he would acknowledge his personal interest in Sarah's fate or attempt to maintain the fiction that his proposals were purely strategic. Including individuals whose current assignments don't reflect their actual capabilities or potential contributions. I see. Queen Lireleth leaned back in her throne, her expression showing calculation mixed with something that might have been respect. Ambassador, I believe I understand your position. You're willing to risk the failure of your entire diplomatic mission to ensure that specific individuals are restored to positions where their talents can be properly utilized. I'm willing to insist that successful partnerships require justice for all parties involved, not just the politically powerful ones. And if I agree to these terms, you believe the resource agreement can proceed to both parties' satisfaction? I believe it can proceed to everyone's satisfaction, including the populations whose lives will be affected by our decisions. Queen Lireleth stood once more, moving with the decisive energy of someone who had reached a conclusion that would reshape multiple lives. Very well, Ambassador Collins. The Viridian Empire accepts Earth's proposed modifications, including the establishment of joint oversight committees staffed by the most qualified individuals available, regardless of their current administrative status. Marcus felt relief flood through him like a physical force. Thank you, Your Majesty. However, she continued, her tone becoming more personal than formal, I want you to understand something important. What's that? The individual whose situation prompted this entire negotiating strategy, she was correct about the long-term consequences of the extraction policies her family opposed. The instabilities I mentioned are real, the environmental concerns were valid, and the social disruptions have created problems that we've been managing through increasingly expensive enforcement rather than addressing through policy reform. Marcus stared at her, understanding that Queen Lireleth was acknowledging something far more significant than mere administrative reassignment. Your Majesty. I have spent 5 years managing the consequences of decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. The revenue was substantial, but the costs have been educational. Then why maintain the policies that created those costs? Because admitting error requires strength that I wasn't certain I possessed until today. Queen Lireleth smiled, an expression that transformed her from imperial authority into someone remarkably human despite her alien features. Your willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice has reminded me that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to acknowledge when previous decisions were wrong. The ceremony that followed was unprecedented in Viridian history, the formal restoration of dozens of individuals to positions that utilized their expertise rather than punished their integrity. Sarah's appointment as Director of Sustainable Development for the Outer Territories was announced alongside similar restorations that created a new framework for imperial governance based on competence and ethical consideration rather than political compliance. You risked everything, Sarah said to Marcus during the celebration that followed the restoration ceremony. Your mission, your career, your standing with both governments. I risked what I could afford to lose for something I couldn't afford to accept losing. Which was the chance to prove that individual actions can create systemic change when they're guided by the right principles and supported by sufficient courage. Sarah smiled, her expression radiant with the joy of someone who had been invisible for years and was finally seen not just as a person, but as someone whose abilities were valued and needed. And now? Now we get to find out whether a human diplomat and a restored Viridian administrator can build the kind of partnership that serves everyone's interests rather than just the politically convenient ones. I think, Sarah said, taking his hand with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to fear the consequences of being visible, that we're going to be very successful. 6 months later, the joint oversight committees had transformed resource extraction throughout the outer territories, creating economic benefits that exceeded the previous extraction yields while improving rather than degrading the conditions for local populations. The model of ethical partnership that Marcus had insisted upon became the standard for interspecies cooperation throughout the sector. But the most important transformation was personal. Marcus's assignment was extended indefinitely to oversee the continuing partnership, while Sarah's work in sustainable development made her one of the most influential advisors in the Empire. Their professional collaboration had evolved into personal partnership that served as a living example of what became possible when people chose to see the invisible and value the undervalued. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked one evening as they walked through the crystal gardens where everything had begun. "Regret what?" "The tears that started all this. The moment you trusted me with the truth about your situation." Sarah considered the question while they paused beside the fountain where she had once hidden her despair from a world that refused to see her pain. "Those tears weren't weakness," she said finally. "They were the beginning of hope. And hope, it turns out, is the most powerful force in the galaxy when it's coupled with someone willing to act on it. Even when acting on it risks everything." "Especially then," Sarah replied, her hand finding his as they watched the crystal formations sing in harmonies that seemed to celebrate the beauty of connection across impossible differences. "The best things in life are the ones worth risking everything to achieve." And in gardens where alien crystals chimed with the music of growing love, they both understood that sometimes the most important discoveries begin with noticing the tears of someone the world has decided doesn't deserve to be seen.